The silver marks crawled across Arya's skin like frozen lightning, a permanent reminder that she had been born wrong. Half her face bore the intricate patterns that shimmered under moonlight, spreading down her neck and consuming her left arm entirely. In a world where omegas were treasured as precious gifts from the moon goddess, Arya Thorne was the exception that proved even divine blessings could be corrupted. The elders had declared it the moment she drew her first breath during a blood eclipse 17 years ago. Cursed, broken, an omega without a wolf, without worth, without a future. Her mother had wept when the midwife refused to touch the newborn, backing away from the squalling infant as though death itself had taken form. Her father had simply looked away, unable to meet the eyes of his malformed daughter. They had kept her, technically, but kept her hidden like a shameful secret, tucked into the shadows of their modest home, on the outskirts of Silverpine Pack territory. While other Omega children were celebrated, trained in healing arts, and prepared for their essential role in Pack society, Arya learned to make herself invisible. She discovered early that invisibility was a kindness people granted when they could not stomach the alternative of confronting what made them uncomfortable. The whispers followed her everywhere during the rare moments she was permitted outside. Mothers pulled their children closer when she passed. Young wolves wrinkled their noses as if she carried disease. The Pack's healer refused to train her despite Omega healing abilities being instinctive, claiming that cursed blood would taint any knowledge passed along. Even the kindest souls offered only pity, and pity was just cruelty wearing a softer mask. By the time Arya turned 16, she had learned that being seen was more dangerous than being invisible. Being acknowledged meant being rejected again and again, each instance a fresh wound on top of scar tissue that never quite healed. The exile came swiftly and without ceremony. Her parents delivered the news over a cold breakfast, eyes fixed on their plates rather than their daughter's face. The Alpha had decreed that she was to be sent to the Borderlands, the forgotten strip of territory where the kingdom's unwanted were deposited and ignored. It was not quite banishment, her father explained with the clinical detachment of someone reading a weather report, but a relocation for the good of the Pack. Young wolves were frightened by her appearance. Families worried her curse might spread. It would be better for everyone, her mother added quietly. If Arya simply went somewhere she could not upset the natural order. Arya had packed her few belongings into a worn canvas bag without protest. What was there to say? She had spent 16 years being a problem that needed solving, and now they had found their solution. The journey to the Borderlands took 3 days by cart, driven by a silent beta who clearly resented the assignment. He left her at the edge of a ramshackle settlement that barely qualified as a village, pointed toward a leaning structure that might have once been an inn, and departed before the dust from his wheels had settled. "Welcome to your new life," the abandonment seemed to say. "Try not to curse anyone here either. The Borderlands were where hope went to die." The settlement housed those who had fallen through the cracks of werewolf society, Pack members who had committed minor offenses and been exiled rather than executed, humans too poor to afford life in proper towns, orphaned children with no family to claim them, elderly wolves whose packs had dissolved or been absorbed into larger territories. It was a place the kingdom's administrators pretended did not exist, except when collecting minimal taxes or conscripting young men for wars fought in distant lands. The structures were built from scavenged materials and desperation. The streets were mud when it rained, and dust when it did not. Disease was common. Hunger was constant. Death was unremarkable. Arya had arrived with 12 silver coins, everything her parents could spare or perhaps everything they felt obligated to provide. She rented a corner of a shared room in a boarding house that smelled of mildew and defeat, paying a week in advance to a landlady whose suspicion melted only slightly when silver changed hands. The other residents avoided her, just as thoroughly as her birth pack had, though here the avoidance felt less personal and more practical. Everyone in the Borderlands was running from something or someone. They had learned not to ask questions that might invite questions in return. Arya's curse was just another mystery in a place built entirely from secrets and second chances that had already been squandered. She found work where she could, though options were limited for an Omega, without a wolf, and with a face that made children cry. She hauled water from the communal well. She scrubbed floors in the settlement's only tavern until the owner's wife decided that Arya's appearance was driving away customers and let her go with half the promised wages. She mended torn clothing for a seamstress who was going blind, working by candlelight in a back room where customers would not have to see her. The pay was barely enough to afford her corner of the room and one meal a day, but Arya had learned to survive on less than barely enough. Survival was a skill she had mastered. Young. It was during one of her water runs that Arya first noticed them. 3 children, none older than 7, huddled in the narrow space between 2 buildings. Their clothes were little more than rags held together by hope and grime. Their faces were hollow with the specific kind of hunger that had moved past painful into numbness. They watched her with the wary eyes of feral cats, ready to bolt if she proved to be another danger in a world that had already shown them too many. Arya knew that. Look, she had worn it herself for most of her life. She set down her water buckets and approached slowly, hands visible and empty of threat. The oldest child, a girl with matted dark hair, shifted to put herself between Arya and the smaller ones, protecting her siblings or perhaps just other strays she had collected along the way. The gesture made something crack open in Arya's chest, some previously sealed chamber where she had locked away the parts of herself that still believed kindness was possible. These children had nothing, and yet they still tried to shield each other from a world determined to devour them whole. Arya reached into the small pouch at her belt and pulled out the heel of bread she had been saving for her own dinner. It was not much, barely 3 mouthfuls, but it was what she had. She broke it into 3 pieces and held them out, keeping her distance so they would not feel cornered. The children stared at the offering with an intensity that spoke of days without food. The oldest girl looked at Arya's scarred face, then at the bread, then back at Arya's eyes as though searching for the trap that surely existed in this transaction. When she found none, she darted forward, snatched the pieces, and retreated to distribute them among her charges. They ate like they were afraid the bread might disappear if they did not consume it immediately. Arya watched them and understood that this was what purpose looked like. Not grand gestures or heroic deeds, but small acts of sharing what little you had with those who had even less. The next day, Arya brought 4 pieces of bread. The day after, she found 5 children waiting. Word spread in the quiet way information traveled among the desperate. The cursed Omega with the silver scars was feeding orphans. Within a week, Arya had a routine. She would work her jobs, accept her meager pay, and spend most of it on whatever food she could afford in bulk. Stale bread from the baker who sold day-old goods at moonlight discount. Bruised vegetables from farmers who could not sell their imperfect produce at proper markets. Thin soup bones that still had enough marrow to make broth if you boiled them long enough. She would prepare what she could in the boarding house's shared kitchen during hours when others were not using it, then distribute the results to the growing number of hungry people who had learned that the Angel of Shadows, as they had started calling her, could be found near the old well each evening. If you are moved by stories of compassion rising from the ashes of cruelty, take a moment to like this video and let us know in the comments what you think about Arya's choice to give when she had so little herself. Subscribe to hear how her simple acts of kindness will shake the foundations of a kingdom built on lies. Arya never asked for gratitude and rarely received it. The people she fed were too broken by life to trust that charity came without strings attached. They took what she offered, with the efficiency of those who had learned that survival meant accepting help when it appeared, and not examining it too closely. She learned their patterns, if not their names. The old woman with the twisted leg who always arrived first, and waited patiently for whatever Arya could spare. The young mother with an infant who never cried, silence being a survival trait in a place where weakness invited exploitation. The man missing 3 fingers who had probably lost them to frostbite or violence, or one of the 1,000 small cruelties that accumulated in places the world forgot. They were ghosts haunting the margins of society. And Arya was a ghost too. Perhaps that was why she saw them when others looked through them as though they were not there at all. Months passed in this rhythm of work and rationing and the quiet satisfaction of easing hunger she could not eliminate. Arya's savings dwindled to nothing. She sold the few possessions she had arrived with, a comb that had belonged to her grandmother, a shawl her mother had woven before deciding her daughter was not worth the effort of loving, a small knife that might have been useful for self-defense if Arya had been the kind of person who believed she was worth defending. The money bought more food, more meals, more moments where children smiled before remembering that smiling was dangerous when you had nothing to smile about. She began sleeping fewer hours to work more jobs. She learned which taverns needed floors scrubbed. In the hours before dawn, she discovered that the tannery would pay a few coins for someone willing to work with the chemicals that burned unprotected skin, and Arya's curse-marked skin seemed no more affected by tanning solutions than it was by anything else that should have hurt. She was distributing soup on an evening when autumn was surrendering to winter's first assault, when she felt it, a prickling awareness that lifted every hair on her arms despite her missing wolf, the sensation of being watched not with the casual curiosity of passers-by but with focused intensity. Arya looked up from the bowl she was filling and found herself staring at a man who could only be royalty or death, and possibly both. He sat astride a midnight black horse that was too well bred for the borderlands, surrounded by warriors whose bearing screamed elite guard. But it was the man himself who stole the breath from Arya's lungs. He was beautiful in the way dangerous things often are, all sharp edges and controlled power. Dark hair touched with silver at the temples despite his relative youth, eyes the color of amber that seemed to catch and hold light, even in the gathering dusk. His face was all angles and aristocratic lines, the face of someone who had never known hunger or fear or rejection. He wore authority like a second skin, invisible but unmistakable. Everything about him declared alpha, and not just any alpha, but the kind who ruled kingdoms rather than simple packs. Arya knew she should lower her gaze. That meeting in Alpha's eyes was a challenge Omegas were never permitted to issue, but something in his expression held her frozen. He was looking at her not with the disgust or pity she had learned to expect, but with an intensity that felt like being seen for the first time in her life. The moment stretched and bent, time becoming negotiable under the weight of recognition neither of them understood. Then one of the children tugged on Arya's sleeve, breaking the spell. She tore her gaze away and returned to ladling soup, heart hammering against her ribs for reasons she could not name. When she risked another glance, the royal party was moving on, though the alpha had turned in his saddle to look back at her. Their eyes met once more before his guard urged him forward, and the group disappeared around a corner. Arya exhaled a breath she had not realized she was holding and tried to convince herself that the encounter meant nothing. Men like that did not concern themselves with cursed Omegas feeding strays in forgotten corners of the kingdom. She was wrong. The Alpha King returned the next evening, this time without his full guard. Only 2 warriors accompanied him, and they remained at a distance while he dismounted and approached Arya's makeshift distribution point on foot. The people gathered for their meal scattered like startled birds, unwilling to be near authority that might ask questions about why they were in the borderlands, or what crimes or misfortunes had brought them there. Only the children remained, too young to have developed proper fear, or too hungry to let caution override desperate need. Arya stood her ground because she had nowhere to run and nothing left to lose. If the Alpha King had come to punish her for some unknown transgression, she would face it standing up. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his amber eyes, far enough that she did not feel trapped. When he spoke, his voice was deeper than she expected, and entirely lacking in the condescension she had braced herself against. "They call you the Angel of Shadows. I wanted to see for myself if the rumors were true." Arya said nothing, unsure what response was expected or safe. The Alpha studied her face without flinching from the silver marks that made others turn away. "You feed them, every night, even though you barely have enough for yourself." It was not a question, but Arya nodded anyway. The Alpha's expression shifted into something that might have been approval, or might have been confusion. Why? The question was so absurd that Arya almost laughed. Why did she feed hungry children? Why did she offer water to the thirsty? Why did she try to ease suffering when she saw it? Because not doing so would make her complicit in the cruelty that had shaped her own life. Because the world had shown her what it felt like to be invisible and worthless, and she refused to inflict that same wound on others. Because kindness cost her everything and nothing, and it was the only form of rebellion available to someone without power or position or hope. She could not articulate any of this, so she gave the simplest answer: because they are hungry, and I have food to share. The Alpha King studied her as though she were a puzzle he was trying to solve. Then he did something that made Arya's breath catch. He pulled a heavy pouch from his belt and placed it in her hands. The weight of it spoke of significant coin, more money than Arya had seen in her entire life. Then share more, he said quietly. This settlement and those in it have been neglected. That changes now. He turned to leave, then paused and looked back at her. What is your name? Your real name. Not the title they have given you. Arya, she whispered, her voice rusty from disuse in conversations that were not about distributing food or negotiating wages. Arya Thorne. Arya, he repeated, and the way he said it made her name sound like something valuable rather than a label attached to a disappointment. I am Caspian Nightshade, and I will return tomorrow. It was a promise and a warning, and something else she could not identify. Then he was gone, mounting his horse and riding away with his guards falling into formation around him. Arya stood clutching the pouch and trying to understand what had just happened. The Alpha King knew her name. He had given her money not as charity, but as investment in her work. He had looked at her face and not flinched. Nothing about this made sense. That night, Arya could not sleep. She lay in her corner of the shared room, listening to the snores and mutters of the other residents, and turned the pouch over in her hands. The coins inside represented months of her usual earnings. She could buy real food, enough to feed not just the children, but the elderly, the sick, the desperate. She could purchase warmer clothes for those facing winter without adequate protection. She could afford medicine for infections that were killing people because they could not pay a healer's fees. The possibilities spiraled outward like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. But beneath the excitement and planning, a thread of fear wound through her thoughts. Why had the Alpha King singled her out? What did he want in return? Men with power never gave without expecting something back. And Arya had nothing to offer except the cursed body she inhabited. Caspian returned the next evening as promised, and the evening after that, and the one after that. He came with fewer guards each time until he was arriving alone, a violation of protocol that made his warriors visibly anxious. He never stayed long, but his presence became a constant. He would watch Arya distribute food and supplies purchased with his money. He would ask questions about the people she served, learning their situations and making notes in a small leather journal he carried. He spoke with the children, who had lost their fear of him, listening to their stories with an attention that suggested he actually cared about the answers. And he spoke with Arya, coaxing her into conversations that ranged from practical matters of how to best help the settlement to more personal revelations about her life and exile. Arya waited for the other shoe to drop, for the moment when Caspian would reveal what he truly wanted from her. But weeks passed, and his behavior remained consistent. He was unfailingly polite. He never touched her without permission. He treated her opinions as valid rather than dismissing them as the thoughts of a cursed Omega who should be grateful for any attention at all. Slowly, carefully, Arya began to trust that perhaps his interest was genuine. Perhaps the Alpha King was exactly what he appeared to be, a man who had seen injustice and wanted to correct it. The idea was so foreign to her experience that accepting it felt like learning a new language. It was during one of these visits that Caspian finally addressed the question hanging between them like smoke. They were sitting on the steps of the old well, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of blood and gold. The children had been fed. The elderly had received their allotment of medicine Caspian had arranged to be delivered from the capital. For a moment, the borderlands felt almost peaceful, as though poverty and suffering were illusions that could be dispelled by enough goodwill and resources. Caspian turned to look at Arya, and the intensity in his amber eyes made her breath catch. I need to tell you something, Arya. Something that will change everything between us. Dread pooled in Arya's stomach. Here it was. The revelation she had been waiting for. The price that would be demanded. The trap she had walked into despite her caution. She forced herself to meet his gaze. to face whatever was coming with the same stubborn dignity she had maintained through every other disappointment and betrayal. "Tell me," she said, voice steady even as her hands trembled. Caspian took a breath as though preparing himself for battle. "You are my mate, my true mate, chosen by the moon goddess herself. I knew it the moment I saw you, though I did not want to believe it at first. But the bond does not lie, Arya. You are mine, and I am yours, whether either of us wishes it or not." The words hit Arya like physical blows. Mate, the bond, impossible. She was cursed, Omega without a wolf, marked as wrong from birth. The moon goddess did not grant bonds to those she had already rejected, and yet as Caspian spoke, Arya felt something shift inside her, a recognition that bypassed logic and reason. She had felt drawn to him from that first meeting, though she had attributed it to his status and presence. Now she understood. The bond had been there all along, muted by her missing wolf, but present nonetheless. "That is not possible," Arya whispered, though even as she said it, she knew it was true. "I am cursed. The elders said so. The moon goddess would not bind you to something broken." Caspian's expression hardened, anger flashing in his eyes, though it was not directed at her. "You are not broken. You are not cursed. And the elders who said otherwise are either fools or liars. And I am beginning to suspect the latter." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her scarred hand in his. His thumb traced the silver marks on her skin with a gentleness that made tears prick at Arya's eyes. "These marks are not a curse, Arya. They are something else entirely, and I intend to find out what. But regardless of their origin, they do not define your worth. You have shown me more about true leadership in these few weeks than most of my council has taught me in years. You are exactly who the moon goddess intended you to be." Arya wanted to believe him. The desperate, broken part of her that had spent 17 years being told she was worthless wanted to grab onto his words and hold them like a lifeline. But trust was not built in moments. It was constructed slowly from consistent actions over time, and Arya had learned that words were easy to speak and difficult to rely upon. "What do you want from me?" she asked, withdrawing her hand from his. "Why are you really here, Caspian? Alpha Kings do not visit borderland settlements. They do not watch cursed Omegas feed orphans. They do not claim bonds with those their kingdoms have rejected. So tell me the truth. What am I to you beyond a curiosity or a charitable project?" The hurt that flashed across Caspian's face looked genuine. But Arya had learned that powerful people were skilled performers when necessary. "You are my mate," he said quietly. "Everything else is secondary to that truth. But you are right that I have not been entirely forthcoming." He stood and paced a few steps away, his posture tense with internal conflict. When he turned back, his expression was grave. "There are things happening in the capital area. Corruption among my council. Policies that benefit the powerful while grinding the vulnerable into dust. I inherited a system built on exploitation and maintained through strategic cruelty. For years, I told myself I was doing what I could within the constraints of tradition and political reality. Then I came here and saw you giving away your last meal to feed children my kingdom has abandoned. You showed me that excuses are just another form of cowardice. You are not a project or a curiosity. You are a mirror reflecting everything I should have been doing and was not." The honesty in his voice rang true, and Arya felt her defenses wavering. She understood the impulse to work within systems even when those systems were fundamentally unjust. She had done it herself, accepting her exile rather than fighting for the right to remain in Silverpine, feeding people in the borderlands rather than demanding the kingdom stop creating conditions that made such charity necessary. Perhaps they were both guilty of choosing survival over revolution. The question was whether either of them had the courage to choose differently now. "If I am truly your mate," Arya said slowly, testing the shape of the words, "what does that mean? Do you expect me to come to the capital, to stand beside you as Luna Queen despite being the cursed Omega your nobles will despise? Or is this bond something we acknowledge privately while maintaining public distance?" Caspian closed the space between them in 2 strides and took her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. It means you are my equal in all things. It means I will stand beside you while you feed the hungry and fight for those this kingdom has failed. It means I will investigate every lie ever told about you and the marks you bear. It means the nobles can despise you all they want, but they will show you respect or face consequences. It means I choose you, Arya, not despite who you are, but because of it. And if you will have me, cursed Alpha King trying to atone for years of looking away when he should have been seeing, then together we will remake this kingdom into something worthy of the people it is meant to serve. Arya searched his face for deception, and found none. She saw determination and hope and fear that she would reject him. She saw a man who had been alone in his power and responsibility, discovering that having a partner might mean having the strength to actually change things rather than simply managing them. Slowly, carefully, she placed her scarred hands over his where they cupped her face. I do not know how to be a Luna Queen. I barely know how to be an Omega, and I still believe I am cursed, no matter what you say. But I know how to be stubborn. I know how to refuse to give up even when everything says I should. And I know how to see people that society has decided do not matter. If those skills are useful to you, then yes, I will try. We will try together. The kiss Caspian pressed to her forehead was chaste and reverent, a seal on the promise they had just made to each other. But beneath the tenderness, Arya felt the heat of the bond igniting, a connection that bypassed her missing wolf and wove itself directly into her soul. She gasped at the intensity of it, this sudden awareness of another person's emotions and presence overlaying her own. She could feel Caspian's relief and determination and a deep well of affection that was still growing into love. She could sense his exhaustion from years of bearing burdens alone, and his hope that she might help carry them. It was overwhelming and terrifying and wonderful all at once. For the first time in her life, Arya was not alone inside her own skin. If you are enjoying this story of two broken people finding strength in each other, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you do not miss what happens next. Share your thoughts in the comments about whether you think Arya and Caspian can truly change the kingdom, or if the forces aligned against them are too powerful to overcome. The journey to the capital took 5 days by royal carriage, a luxury Arya had never imagined experiencing. Caspian had arranged for her to travel in comfort with a small guard detail, while he rode ahead to begin preparing the court for her arrival. He had wanted her to come with him immediately, but Arya had insisted on time to say goodbye to the people she had been serving and to ensure they would continue to be cared for in her absence. Caspian had not only agreed, but had assigned a permanent administrator to the borderland settlement with a budget sufficient to address the systematic neglect that had defined the region for decades. It was a gesture that spoke louder than words about his commitment to actually changing things rather than simply making promises. The capital city of Lunaris was everything the borderlands were not: clean, prosperous, orderly, beautiful. Buildings of white stone gleamed in the sunlight. Gardens bloomed with flowers Arya could not name. Well-dressed wolves went about their business with the casual confidence of those who had never wondered where their next meal would come from. It was magnificent and obscene all at once, this concentration of wealth existing in the same kingdom as the desperate poverty Arya had left behind. She pressed her face to the carriage window and tried to imagine how the resources spent on a single decorative fountain might have fed every child in the borderlands for a month. The mathematics of inequality were staggering. The royal palace was even more overwhelming. All soaring ceilings and marble floors and tapestries that probably cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Servants in crisp uniforms moved through hallways with efficient grace. Nobles in expensive clothing clustered in conversation groups, their laughter musical and empty. Arya felt like a smudge of dirt on a pristine canvas, her simple dress and silver-marked face standing out against the calculated perfection surrounding her. She was acutely aware of the stares that followed her, the whispers that started and stopped as she passed. The cursed Omega, the Alpha King's supposed mate, the aberration being inflicted upon proper society. She lifted her chin and met their gazes squarely, refusing to shrink or apologize for existing. Caspian met her in the throne room, a vast space, dominated by a seat of power, carved from a single piece of black marble. He descended from the throne to greet her personally, taking her hand and raising it to his lips in a gesture that made the assembled courtiers gasp. "My mate," he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Arya Thorne, Luna Queen of this realm by right of the bond and my choice. You will show her the respect due her position, or you will answer to me personally." The silence that followed was deafening. Arya could feel the shock and outrage rolling off the nobles in waves. A few looked merely scandalized. Others appeared genuinely horrified. An elderly man in elaborate robes stepped forward, his expression thunderous. "Your Majesty, surely you cannot be serious. This Omega bears the mark of curse. The old texts are clear that such marked individuals bring misfortune to any pack that harbors them. As your chief advisor, I must counsel against this match." Caspian's hand tightened on Arya's, though his expression remained neutral. "As my chief advisor, Lord Aldrich, you will respect my decision. The bond is not subject to council approval. Arya is my mate, and she will be your Luna Queen. If the old texts concern you, perhaps you should reread them more carefully. I suspect you will find they say rather less about curses, and rather more about power than you remember." The exchange sent a ripple of unease through the assembled nobles. Arya studied Lord Aldrich more closely, and saw something flicker behind his eyes. Fear, perhaps, or recognition, as though Caspian's words had struck closer to some hidden truth than the advisor was comfortable with. The moment passed quickly, smoothed over by Aldrich's practiced court smile. "Of course, Your Majesty. Forgive my concern. I am merely protective of your well-being and that of the kingdom." "Your concern is noted," Caspian said with a tone that suggested the matter was closed. He turned to Arya and offered his arm. "Come. I will show you to your chambers. You must be exhausted from the journey." Arya accepted his arm and allowed herself to be guided from the throne room, acutely aware of the eyes boring into her back and the whispered conversations resuming the moment they were out of sight. She had entered a nest of vipers, and she was fairly certain that Lord Aldrich was the most venomous of them all. Caspian's chambers, which he explained would now be their chambers once they completed the formal mating ceremony, were larger than the entire boarding house Arya had lived in at the borderlands. A massive bed dominated one wall, draped in silks that probably required an entire team of servants to maintain. Windows overlooked gardens so carefully manicured that they barely seemed real. A bathing room featured a tub large enough to swim in, with heated water that flowed from pipes built into the walls. It was luxury beyond anything Arya had dreamed possible, and it made her profoundly uncomfortable. How could she live like this? Knowing that people were starving in settlements her new kingdom pretended did not exist. Caspian must have read the conflict on her face because he pulled her into his arms and held her gently. "I know," he murmured against her hair. "I know it seems wrong. It felt wrong to me, too, once I started truly seeing. But we cannot help anyone by refusing to use the resources available to us. This palace, this position, this power, they are tools. And we are going to use them to dismantle every unjust system that keeps people hungry and afraid. Starting with discovering the truth about your marks and why the elders were so determined to convince everyone they represented a curse." Arya pulled back to look at him. "You truly believe the marks mean something other than what I was told?" "I am certain of it," Caspian said firmly. "I have already sent word to the royal archives. Every text mentioning Omegas with silver marks is being pulled and brought to my personal study. We will find answers, Arya, and I suspect those answers will explain why Lord Aldrich looked so uncomfortable when I mentioned them." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "There is something else you should know. The blood eclipse under which you were born. It has only occurred 7 times in recorded history. Each time an Omega was born bearing silver marks. And each time, that Omega disappeared within months of birth. You are the only one who survived." The revelation hit Arya like ice water. "Disappeared? You mean killed?" "Eliminated," Caspian corrected grimly. "The records are carefully vague, but the pattern is clear. 7 blood eclipses, 7 marked Omegas, 7 convenient deaths attributed to various accidents or illnesses. You survived only because your parents kept you hidden, and the pack elders were content to simply exile you rather than go to the trouble of arranging your death. But someone, somewhere, has been systematically removing Omegas like you from existence for centuries. And I intend to find out who and why. Arya sat down heavily on the edge of the massive bed, her mind reeling. Everything she had been told about herself was a lie. The curse was a fabrication designed to justify her elimination. The marks were not proof of wrongness, but evidence of something someone wanted desperately to suppress. What if discovering the truth puts you in danger? She asked quietly. What if the people behind these deaths are still in power? What if they are in this palace right now? Caspian knelt before her, taking her hands in his. Then we will face that danger together. You have been alone and undefended your entire life, Arya. That ends now. You have me. You have the bond, and you have every resource of the crown behind you. We will uncover this conspiracy, and we will make sure no other Omega suffers what you suffered. I promise you that. Arya believed him, though she suspected they were both underestimating the forces aligned against them. But for the first time, she was not facing the world alone. She had a partner who saw her as valuable rather than cursed. She had power, even if she was still learning how to wield it. And she had motivation beyond simple survival. She would not let the Omegas who had been killed before her die for nothing. Their stolen lives would be avenged through the truth finally being brought to light. It was a purpose worth any risk. The formal presentation to the court took place 3 days later, an elaborate ceremony that felt more like performance art than governance. Arya wore a gown of deep blue that Caspian had chosen because it brought out the silver in her marks rather than trying to hide them. She stood beside him on the dais while noble after noble approached to offer their congratulations, most of which rang hollow with barely concealed contempt. She smiled and nodded and played the role of gracious Luna Queen while internally cataloging who might be ally and who was certainly enemy. List of potential allies was depressingly short, but there were a few. A young noblewoman named Elena, who approached with genuine warmth and whispered that she admired what Arya had done in the borderlands. An older warrior named Marcus, who had served Caspian's father, and who looked at Arya with something like approval, as though she had passed some test she had not known she was taking. A scholar from the Royal University, who stammered an introduction and mentioned he had been researching blood. Eclipses. Perhaps they might speak later about his findings. Each small alliance felt like a victory against the tide of hostility. Lord Aldrich approached last, his smile sharp as a blade. Luna Queen Arya, what a pleasure to formally welcome you to court. I do hope you will find our traditions and protocols manageable. They can be quite complex for those unfamiliar with noble society. The condescension dripped from every word, a reminder that Arya was an outsider being inflicted upon them, rather than a chosen leader. I am certain you wish only the best for our kingdom. Perhaps we might speak privately sometime about how best to navigate these new responsibilities. I would hate for any misunderstandings to arise from unfamiliarity with how things are done. Arya met his gaze with the same steady defiance she had shown every person who had ever tried to make her feel small. I appreciate your offer, Lord Aldrich, but I find that traditions often benefit those who created them more than those they govern. I am quite comfortable with being unfamiliar with how things are done, if how things are done involves ignoring suffering and perpetuating injustice. Perhaps it is the traditions that need to learn to navigate me, rather than the reverse. The shocked silence that greeted her words was broken by Caspian's bark of laughter. Well said, my heart. I believe Lord Aldrich understands your position now. He dismissed the advisor with a nod that was just polite enough to avoid being an insult, and guided Arya away from the gathering. Once they were alone in a private corridor, he pulled her into his arms and kissed her with an intensity that made her knees weak. You are magnificent, he breathed against her lips. They expect you to be meek and grateful. Watching you refuse to shrink yourself is better than any entertainment the court has provided in years. Arya laughed shakily, adrenaline still singing through her veins from the confrontation. I just made an enemy of your most powerful advisor. That was probably not wise. You made an enemy of someone who was already your enemy. Caspian corrected. The difference is now he knows you will not be easily intimidated or controlled. Trust me, Arya. In this court, showing weakness invites attack. You just demonstrated that attacking you comes with consequences. Half the nobles in that room are reassessing their positions right now. He was right. Over the following weeks, Arya noticed a shift in how she was treated. The outright hostility lessened, replaced by wary respect. Nobles who had ignored her started seeking brief conversations. Her opinions in council meetings were not dismissed quite so quickly. It was not acceptance, not yet, but it was acknowledgement that she was a force to be considered, rather than an inconvenience to be endured. She was learning to navigate power, and discovering that perhaps she had more aptitude for it than anyone, including herself, had expected. Meanwhile, Caspian was making good on his promises. The borderland settlement received a new school staffed with teachers from the capital. A healer's clinic was established with supplies and personnel sufficient to serve the entire region. Infrastructure projects began to repair roads and buildings that had been neglected for decades. It was not nearly enough to address all the systematic failures, but it was a start, and it sent a message that the Alpha King was paying attention to parts of the kingdom that had been invisible for too long. But progress brought resistance. Anonymous letters began appearing, warning Caspian that his reforms were upsetting the natural order. Several nobles who had supported the changes found their estates vandalized or their trade agreements mysteriously cancelled. The scholar who had mentioned blood eclipse research died in what was officially ruled an accidental fall, though his rooms had been thoroughly searched and his papers removed before the body was discovered. Someone was pushing back, and they were willing to kill to protect whatever secrets they were hiding. Arya threw herself into her own investigation, spending hours in the royal archives reading every text she could find about Omega history and blood eclipses. The patterns emerged slowly but unmistakably. Omegas with silver marks were always described as possessing unusual healing abilities that went beyond normal Omega gifts. They could cure diseases thought incurable. They could restore fertility to those believed barren. They could even, according to some accounts, heal psychological wounds and break magical curses. They were living miracles, and they had been systematically exterminated because their power threatened those who controlled healing knowledge and profited from keeping it scarce and expensive. The current system required Omegas to be trained by established healers who controlled what knowledge was passed along and who was permitted to practice. An Omega who could heal instinctively, without training or permission, undermined that entire structure. If people knew such Omegas existed and were being killed to maintain the Healer Guild's monopoly on medical knowledge, the outrage would destroy the guild and everyone who benefited from its artificial scarcity. Lord Aldrich's family, Arya discovered, had controlled the Healer Guild for 3 generations. His wealth and influence came directly from maintaining the system that required her kind to be eliminated. Arya brought her findings to Caspian late one night, spreading the ancient texts across his desk while he listened with growing anger. "They have been murdering Omega children for centuries to protect profit margins," she said, voice shaking with fury. "Every Omega like me who died was killed to preserve a corrupt system, and Lord Aldrich is neck-deep in it." Caspian's eyes had gone wolf gold with rage, his alpha power pressing against the room like a physical force. "We cannot prove it yet. The texts suggest it, but do not name names or provide direct evidence of current conspiracy. If we accuse Aldrich without absolute proof, he will use every legal and political tool available to destroy us and continue the cover-up." He forced himself to breathe, to push the wolf back under control. "We need more. We need documentation of actual murders. We need proof that the current guild leadership is aware of and participating in the conspiracy. And we need to ensure that when we strike hard enough that they cannot recover or retaliate. How do we get that proof?" Arya asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "We make them desperate enough to make mistakes," Caspian said grimly. "We announce that you are pregnant." Arya's breath caught. They had not discussed children, had barely discussed completing the mating bond ceremony that would fully cement their connection. "But I am not pregnant. They do not know that," Caspian pointed out. "And if you are carrying the next generation of marked Omegas, if your child might inherit your abilities and expose the truth simply by existing, Then they will have to act. We set a trap using you as bait, and when they come for you or the fictitious child, we catch them in the act. It was risky and terrifying and absolutely necessary. Arya understood that. But the idea of painting a target on herself, of actively inviting the people who had murdered 7 Omegas to come for her, made her stomach twist with fear. She was not a warrior or a strategist. She was just a cursed Omega who had learned to feed hungry children. How had she become someone plotting to take down centuries-old conspiracies and risk her life to expose corruption at the highest levels of the kingdom? Caspian seemed to read her thoughts. He came around the desk and pulled her into his arms, holding her close while she trembled against him. I will not let them hurt you. I will assign my best guards. I will have the royal physician examine you regularly to maintain the fiction. I will move our private chambers to the most secure section of the palace. You will never be alone or undefended. And if it becomes too dangerous, we abort the plan immediately. Your safety matters more than any conspiracy. No, Arya said quietly, pulling back to meet his eyes. My safety matters exactly as much as the truth. Those 7 Omegas who died before me deserve justice. Every Omega who will be born in the future deserves to live without fear of being murdered for possessing the gifts the moon goddess gave them. We see this through, Caspian, whatever the cost. The announcement of the pregnancy was made the following week, during a formal court gathering. Caspian delivered the news with appropriate gravity and joy, while Arya stood beside him, trying to look radiant, rather than terrified. The nobles offered congratulations. Plans were discussed for securing succession and celebrating the future heir. Lord Aldrich's expression remained carefully neutral, but Arya caught the flash of calculation in his eyes. The trap had been set. Now they could only wait to see who took the bait. The first attempt came within days, clumsy and easily thwarted. A servant tried to deliver food to Arya's chambers that had been poisoned with nightshade, enough to cause miscarriage even if it did not kill her outright. The servant, when questioned, claimed she had been paid by a hooded figure she could not identify. She was obviously lying, but proving who had actually hired her was impossible. Still, it confirmed that someone was moving against Arya. The conspiracy was real and active. The second attempt was more sophisticated, a spell woven into a gift of cloth that would have caused anyone who wore it to miscarry. Only the royal mage's careful examination caught the curse before Arya had a chance to have a dress made from the fabric. Again, the trail led nowhere conclusive. Whoever was orchestrating these attacks was being careful, to avoid direct connection. But they were also getting more desperate, and desperation led to mistakes. The third attempt was the one that finally gave them the proof they needed. One of Aldrich's own servants, pressured beyond endurance by the Lord's increasingly frantic demands, approached Caspian directly and confessed everything. Lord Aldrich had ordered him to obtain a specific poison from a black market alchemist, a poison designed to not only cause miscarriage, but to ensure the mother could never carry another child. The servant provided dates, locations, and correspondence that tied Aldrich directly to the conspiracy. Armed with this evidence, Caspian struck. Lord Aldrich was arrested during a council meeting, surrounded by guards before he could flee or call for help from allies. His estates were searched, yielding documents that confirmed everything Arya had discovered and worse. Records of payments made to dispose of marked Omegas, letters coordinating with other noble families to maintain the Healer Guild monopoly, even a journal belonging to Aldrich's grandfather that proudly detailed how he had personally ordered the death of 3 Omega children during his lifetime, describing them as necessary cullings to preserve order and prosperity. The trial was swift and public. Every piece of evidence was presented before the assembled court and representatives from packs across the kingdom. The Healer Guild was implicated and subsequently dissolved, its leaders facing their own trials for corruption and complicity in murder. Nobles who had participated in or enabled the conspiracy were stripped of titles and lands. The magnitude of the corruption was staggering, reaching into nearly every major institution in the kingdom. But sunlight proved to be an effective disinfectant. Exposed to truth, the conspiracy crumbled. Arya testified at the trial, her voice clear and steady as she described being told she was cursed, being exiled, being made to feel worthless, and broken. She testified about the children in the borderlands who were starving, while nobles hoarded wealth, extracted through artificial scarcity and exploitation. She testified about the 7 Omegas murdered before her and demanded that their names be remembered and honored. She was not a victim seeking pity, but a survivor demanding justice, and the court was transfixed by her testimony. When the verdicts came down, they were harsh. Lord Aldrich was executed for his crimes, his family stripped of all titles and holdings. Other conspirators faced imprisonment or exile. The Healer Guild's assets were seized and redistributed to establish free healing clinics throughout the kingdom. Laws were passed protecting Omegas and prohibiting discrimination based on marks or perceived curses. It was not perfect justice. Nothing could return the lives that had been stolen. But it was accountability. It was change. It was progress. In the aftermath, as the kingdom slowly began to rebuild systems that prioritized people over profit, Arya and Caspian finally completed their mating ceremony. It was a private affair, witnessed only by a few close friends and allies, because some things were too sacred to turn into public spectacle. When Caspian marked her neck, and Arya felt the bond snap fully into place, she finally understood what it meant to be whole. She had a wolf, she realized with shock and joy. The curse had never been a curse, but a seal, magical bonds placed by the original conspirators to suppress Omega abilities from birth. With the conspiracy destroyed and the truth exposed, the seal had broken. Her wolf was gentle and strong, emerging from years of forced dormancy to finally take her place in Arya's soul. They stood together on the palace balcony overlooking Lunaris as the sun rose on a new day and a new era. Caspian's arms were wrapped around her from behind, his chin resting on top of her head. "We did it," he murmured. "We actually changed things. We started to change." "Things," Arya corrected gently. "There is still so much work to do. So many broken systems to fix. So many people still suffering. Then we will keep working," Caspian promised. "Together, for as long as it takes. You showed me that leadership is not about maintaining order or managing problems. It is about having the courage to tear down what is unjust and build something better in its place. You showed me how to actually see people, instead of looking through them. You made me a better king and a better man." Arya turned in his arms to face him, her silver marks catching the early morning light and gleaming like living metal. "You gave me a voice when I had been silenced. You gave me power when I had been powerless. You chose me when the world said I was worthless. We made each other better, Caspian. That is what true mates do." They kissed as the sun cleared the horizon. Two people who had been broken in different ways, discovering that together they were stronger than either could have been alone. In the city below, the kingdom was waking to new possibilities. In the borderlands, children were eating breakfast at the new school and receiving treatment at the free clinic. In healing halls across the realm, Omegas were beginning to practice abilities that had been suppressed for generations, rediscovering gifts that had never been curses at all. And in the palace, the Luna Queen with silver marks stood beside her Alpha King and planned the next phase of revolution disguised as reform, because changing the world was not a single dramatic gesture, but 1,000 small choices made consistently over time. They had exposed one conspiracy. Now they would dismantle the others. They had freed one group of oppressed Omegas. Now they would address every other injustice they could find. It would be the work of a lifetime, and they were only just beginning. But beginnings, Arya had learned, were powerful things. They were the moment when what seemed impossible became merely difficult. And difficult was something she had been conquering her entire life. The Angel of Shadows had become Luna Queen, and the kingdom would never be the same. If this story moved you, please share it with others who need to hear that being different is not the same as being cursed, and that kindness can change the world. Like, comment what you loved most, and subscribe for more stories about finding strength in unexpected places, and love that transforms everything it touches. Peace your Omar. Engagement helps these stories reach others who need them. Thank you for being here.